Becker, just turning to you, what challenges do you think Obama faces within the US?
Well, he faces, first of all, the fact that even though the Republicans are in the minority in both houses of Congress, minorities are not without their power in the Congress, particularly in the Senate. And so we saw with this stimulus bill, he had to compromise, at least at the margins, to draw enough Republican votes to get the bill through the Senate. And we'll probably see similar kinds of compromises having to be made on whatever his next thing is. He's talking about a financial bailout. He's talking about possibly health care reform down the road. And these are, really big, complex problems that don't get done easily by narrow margins in the U.S. Congress. They usually require large majorities. And so even though there are fairly sizable Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, both houses of Congress are fairly polarized ideologically, and so it's going to be difficult to sort of forge the kinds of compromises he needs, and it's going to become more difficult over time if his popularity begins to erode, which is kind of the common pattern that we see.
Okay. Donal, I open up the question to you. What kind of challenges he will face outside of the U.S.?
Well, outside, I think he hasn't been tested yet. I think the Israeli army, for apparent reasons, ended their offensive in Gaza on Inauguration Day. So they didn't want to leave him with that first challenge. I think there's a lot of difficult obstacles ahead. Afghanistan obviously is the first one. He will have to not only divert troops from Iraq to Afghanistan, but also secure support from other countries to send more troops, and that will maybe be the first sticking point for many governments, where any kind of warfare is a thing of the past or something which they have to come to grips with. Most of these interventions have been rather unpopular, and Afghanistan just takes second place to Iraq. I think that might be a difficulty in many European countries to convince the governments to support the United States and send more troops. The other issue, of course, is Iran. And in the past, we've seen that there are plenty of opportunities for division between the US and Europe on Iran. Generally speaking, the Europeans, especially the French and perhaps the Germans, favor a much more conciliatory policy towards Iran. Now, we haven't seen any particular strong stance of the Obama administration right now. That I think that is coming at some stage. And I think a lot of the countries are just adopting a wait-and-see attitude. Russia, for example, is also offering a little bit of a carrot and a stick. And they try to throw the US out of Kyrgyzstan, of an Air Force base that they used for Afghanistan. Yet they also offered logistical support for American supplies to Afghanistan. So every country is kind of maneuvering and waiting what kind of policy Obama and Hillary Clinton are going to follow.
Okay, I turn back to Larry. How do you think Obama is going to restore people's confidence?
Well, I mean, that's a kind of fuzzy thing, restoring people's confidence. And I think in some ways he's done what he can do, which is to, just the sort of symbol of Obama, and people were very excited about the inauguration. And, as Shirley mentioned, the passing of the stimulus bill itself perhaps has some psychological effect, that people feel like the government's starting to do something and so on. I think also, one of the things that's, to go back to something Shirley said about tax cuts versus spending, one of the things that's been missed in the story over the stimulus bill is that about $280 billion of the cost of the stimulus is tax cuts. So it isn't as if there's no tax cuts in there. There's a lot more spending, of course, a little more than $500 billion worth of spending. But if you just look at the tax cut side of it, that's $280 billion over 2 years that is compares favorably with virtually any tax cut in history, the Kennedy tax cuts or the Reagan tax cuts.
You have to cut the marginal tax rates. Lowering taxes is different than actually how you do it and how people perceive it to be in the future. So you can say, we're going to cut taxes on certain households. That's different than telling an entrepreneur that the tax rate on the last dollar that he earns is coming down. So that's the incentive effect associated with taxes that economists look for, is the marginal tax rate, not the average tax rate. But I know it doesn't, the stimulus package, my understanding is that it has a bunch of stuff, policy stuff in it, that there's a health, they're setting up some kind of a health agency that's going to look at different kinds of treatments and decide what's right and wrong and tell doctors what to do. So there's a lot of policy in the stimulus package, which you would have taken been much more difficult to get through Congress if it had gone through by each individual the concept or the program.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's always the nature of big bills. There's always stuff in there that is either tangentially related or totally unrelated. But the only point I was trying to make about the tax cut is that it, and I'm not an economist, and Shirley is, but I would just say that, you're putting money in people's pockets. And the idea, at least, behind what they're trying to do is especially put money in the pockets of people further down the economic ladder, at least middle-class people who presumably are going to go spend this money on something and hope that that has a stimulative effect. Whether or not it does, an economist like Shirley could speak to that much more intelligently than I could. But in terms of the psychological effect, it may have an effect that people are feeling like there's help coming from the government. I'm going to be able to make this mortgage payment maybe that I didn't think I would be able to make before, and that may be part of the battle.
Okay. And everyone is talking about how the economy is actually going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Do you think people's confidence is actually going to follow this trend at all?
We'll see. I don't know. I mean, it's people get very excited about Obama, and he gives great speeches and inspiring speeches, and people get very excited. But that only lasts so long. And if you've lost your job, or you're not getting the raise you wanted, or your prices of food and gas are going up, and those kinds of things are there for you the next day and after the speech is over, and so those kinds of things can be really difficult to overcome.
Okay. And is public support really that important in the first 100 days, or is it merely just a number, just 100 days?
No, I think it's everything. I mean, it's if you and it's not just in Obama's case. If you look at the successes most presidents have, most of their big legislative success is in their first year and in the first part of their first year. And it's because they're able, for at least a short period of time, to rally the public behind their policy proposals, and that public support can move at least a number of members of Congress who worry about opposing a popular president. So I think public support is everything early on.
Okay. And we actually talked earlier about whether there's room for Obama to make radical changes. What are your thoughts on that?
It's always difficult, and it becomes more difficult as time goes on. And the American constitutional system is not one that's designed for big radical changes, and we historically have had these sort of isolated moments where big things have been done, like the New Deal programs, like some of the Great Society programs, but those moments tend to be fairly fleeting. And then usually as the president's popularity fades, but more generally as kind of excitement over these programs fade and people become disappointed over the details or over the lack of an effect of some of these programs, excitement for the programs fade. And so if he's going to do big radical things, they're going to have to be soon, and they're going to have to happen quickly, I think, because that's the historical pattern. Very quickly we'll probably settle back into a more normal kind of incrementalist kind of pattern.